My groom shaved his head 5 days before our wedding. I made sure he matched the theme. My fiancé Jason had beautiful thick brown hair that I loved running my fingers through. We'd been planning our wedding for 18 months, and every detail was perfect. The photographer we'd hired specialized in romantic sunset shots and kept saying how Jason's hair would look amazing in golden hour lighting. I'd picked out his suit, the groomsmen's outfits, even the specific hair gel he should use. Everything was coordinated to match our garden theme. 5 days before the wedding, Jason went out with his buddies for a casual bachelor party. They went to a sports bar to watch the game and have some beers. Nothing crazy, which is what we'd agreed on. Jason came home at 2 in the morning and went straight to bed. When I woke up the next morning and looked at him, his head was completely shaved. Not short, not buzzed, but razor shaved to the skin. He looked like a cue ball. I shook him awake, screaming what happened to his hair. He laughed and said the guys dared him to do it, and he never backed down from a dare. He actually said it was just hair, and would grow back. I reminded him our wedding was in 5 days, and we had a professional photographer coming. He said the photos would be even more unique now, and that bald was a choice plenty of men made. I showed him our inspiration board with all the romantic garden photos where grooms had nice hair. He rolled his eyes and said I was being shallow, and if I loved him, it shouldn't matter what his head looked like. His mom called later that day after seeing his post about his new look and asked if he'd lost his mind. He told her I was overreacting and that confident men could pull off any hairstyle. His groomsmen were shocked when they saw him at the rehearsal. His best man asked why he'd do that right before the wedding, and Jason said he was tired of being told what to do with his appearance. He said after the wedding I'd probably try to control him even more, so this was his last stand as a free man. The photographer pulled me aside at the rehearsal dinner and asked if we wanted to postpone since Jason's look didn't match the romantic aesthetic we'd discussed. Jason overheard and said any real professional could work with what they had. He told the photographer that maybe this would push his creativity. The photographer looked at me helplessly, while Jason laughed about how everyone was taking this too seriously. The morning of the wedding, I made my own decision. While Jason was getting ready with his groomsmen, I had my hairstylist completely change my look. I'd had long blonde hair down to my waist that Jason always said was my best feature. The hairstylist cut it into a severe bob and dyed it jet black. Then I had the makeup artist give me dramatic goth makeup instead of the natural romantic look we'd planned. Dark purple lips, heavy black eyeliner, and pale white foundation. I looked like I was going to a funeral, not a garden wedding. When it was time for the first look photos, I walked up behind Jason. He turned around expecting to see his blonde bride and instead got Wednesday Addams. His face went from excited to confused to angry in about 3 seconds. He asked what I'd done to myself, and I said I'd never back down from a dare either. My bridesmaids had dared me to do something bold and memorable. He said this wasn't funny, and I was ruining our wedding photos. I reminded him that hair was just hair like he'd said, and that confident women could pull off any look. The photographer tried to make it work, but every shot looked insane. A bald groom and a goth bride in a sunny garden with pastel flowers everywhere. Jason kept trying to get me to wash off the makeup at least, but I said any real professional photographer could work with what they had. Maybe this would push their creativity like he'd said. During the ceremony, guests kept whispering about what happened to both of us. Jason's grandmother asked if we'd joined a cult. My aunt thought we'd had a fight and were trying to ruin things for each other. The officiant kept stumbling over his words because he was so distracted by how different we looked from the rehearsal. The reception was even worse, like watching a slow-motion car crash. Every smile felt fake and every laugh sounded forced. The DJ tried to get people dancing, but most guests just stood around in small groups staring at us and talking behind their hands. I could see Jason's college friends gathered near the bar, pointing at his bald head and probably making jokes about what happened. My work friends kept shooting me concerned looks like they wanted to rescue me but didn't know how. The wedding coordinator kept trying to move things along according to the timeline, but everything felt off schedule and wrong. When it was finally time to cut the cake, I wanted to just skip it entirely. But the photographer was already positioning us in front of the 3-tiered white cake, covered in sugar flowers that matched our garden theme. Jason and I stood there with the knife between us, and I could feel the tension radiating off his body. The photographer counted down and told us to smile, but my face felt frozen. We cut the first slice together, and I picked up a small piece to feed him like we'd practiced. Jason picked up his piece, and I expected him to gently place it near my mouth like normal couples do. Instead, he shoved it hard into my face, smearing black frosting all over my goth makeup and getting cake up my nose. It wasn't playful or cute, it was aggressive and meant to humiliate me. Something inside me snapped, and I grabbed my piece of cake and smashed it directly into his bald head, grinding it into his scalp with both hands. The white frosting and cake crumbs stuck to his shiny head and dripped down his forehead. The entire reception went completely silent. Not a single person spoke or moved or even seemed to breathe. Everyone just stared at us like we'd lost our minds, which maybe we had. The photographer lowered his camera slowly and backed away from us like we might attack him next. Jason's face turned red and he wiped cake off his head with shaking hands. I had frosting all over my face and dress, and I could taste the sweetness mixed with my purple lipstick. Our wedding coordinator appeared out of nowhere and grabbed both our arms. She spoke in a low, urgent voice, saying we needed to take a break in the bridal suite right now. Jason pulled his arm away from her and walked toward the exit without looking at me. I followed about 10 feet behind him, not wanting to be anywhere near him, but also not wanting to stay in that silent room full of shocked guests. As we walked through the reception area, I heard the whispers start up again, louder this time. Someone said this was the most uncomfortable wedding they'd ever been to. Another voice said, we clearly weren't ready to get married. Jason's grandmother told someone nearby that she knew this would be a disaster the moment she saw us at the ceremony. My maid of honor tried to follow us, but the coordinator waved her off and said we needed space. The walk to the bridal suite felt like a mile, even though it was probably only 100 feet. Jason stayed ahead of me the whole time, his shoulders tense and his hands clenched into fists. I could see cake still stuck in the stubble that was starting to grow back on his head. When we got to the suite, he went in first, and I entered a few seconds later. The coordinator closed the door behind us and said she'd give us 15 minutes to pull ourselves together. The bridal suite was decorated with flowers and had a big mirror surrounded by lights where I'd gotten ready that morning. That felt like a year ago now instead of just hours. Jason stood on one side of the room and I stood on the other, as far apart as we could get. He looked completely drained, like all the fight had gone out of him. His tux was covered in frosting, and his bald head had white streaks where I'd smashed the cake. I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. The goth makeup was smeared and mixed with cake frosting. My severe black bob looked messy, and my white dress had black and white stains all over the front. I looked like some kind of deranged Halloween bride. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. I could hear muffled music and voices from the reception through the walls. Someone laughed loudly and it sounded wrong. Like, how could anyone be laughing when our wedding had turned into such a nightmare? Jason broke the silence first. He said this was exactly what he was afraid would happen. That after the wedding, I'd try to control every single part of his life, and he'd lose himself completely. His voice was flat and tired instead of angry. I felt my own anger flare up again, and I told him he had no right to talk about control when he destroyed our wedding photos on purpose, just to prove some stupid point about being his own person. He said it wasn't about the photos. It was about respect and feeling like an actual partner, instead of just a prop in my perfect fantasy wedding. I fired back that if he wanted respect, he shouldn't have shaved his head 5 days before our wedding without even talking to me first. He said if I respected him, I wouldn't have cared so much about his hair in the first place. We started really fighting then, not the cold, silent war we'd been waging at the reception, but actual loud shouting. I could hear my voice getting higher and more shrill, but I couldn't stop myself. Jason yelled that I'd treated him like an accessory to my perfect wedding instead of like a person with his own thoughts and feelings. He said I'd picked out every single detail from his suit to his hair gel, to where he should stand, and when he should smile, and he felt like a mannequin I was dressing up for photos. I screamed back that he was being dramatic, and that planning a wedding meant making decisions about how things should look. He shouted that I never once asked him what he wanted or how he felt about any of it. Every choice was mine, and he was just expected to show up and follow orders like a good little groom. I threw back that he was so scared of being controlled that he couldn't handle basic consideration or compromise. If he had problems with my planning, he should have said something months ago instead of going along with everything, and then sabotaging the whole wedding at the last minute. Jason's face changed, and he admitted something that made my stomach drop. He said his friends had been telling him for months that I was too demanding and controlling. They kept saying marriage would trap him, and he'd lose his identity and become one of those guys who has to ask permission for everything. I realized in that moment that his bachelor party wasn't just about a stupid dare. His friends had been working on him, convincing him to rebel against me, and shaving his head was his way of proving he was still his own man. Jason confessed that his friends kept saying marriage would trap him and make him lose himself. They told him stories about their own relationships where their girlfriends or wives controlled everything, and they felt miserable. When they dared him to shave his head, it felt like a way to prove he was still in charge of his own choices. He could see I was hurt by this, but he said it didn't change the fact that their concerns weren't totally wrong. Hearing this made me realize how much outside pressure had influenced his decision, but it didn't erase the hurt of what he'd done. His friends had poisoned him against me, and he'd let them. I told him I spent 18 months planning our dream wedding, and he destroyed it in one night without even talking to me first. Every detail I'd chosen was because I wanted our day to be beautiful and memorable and perfect. I showed him inspiration boards and color swatches, and asked him to help pick vendors, but he always said he didn't care, and I should just choose what I wanted. Jason's expression shifted and he said that was exactly the problem. I never asked what his dream wedding looked like. I just told him what to wear and how to style his hair and where to stand for photos. He went along with everything because he thought that's what he was supposed to do, but inside he felt more and more like he was erased. The truth of his words hit me hard because he was right. I had made every single decision without really including him. When he said he didn't care about details, I took that as permission to do whatever I wanted instead of digging deeper to find out what actually mattered to him. I'd been so focused on creating my perfect vision that I never stopped to think about whether it was our vision. But I pointed out that he never objected or spoke up until he did something deliberately hurtful 5 days before the wedding. If he felt controlled or erased, he should have told me months ago when we could have actually fixed things together. Jason admitted he should have communicated better instead of going nuclear with the head shaving. He said he was wrong to handle it that way, and he knew it hurt me and ruined something I'd worked hard on. I admitted I should have noticed I was planning a wedding for myself instead of for us. I should have pushed harder to get his real input instead of accepting his passive agreement as actual participation. We were both crying now, standing in this bridal suite in our ridiculous costumes of revenge. His bald head and my goth makeup made the moment feel even more unreal, like we were actors in some dark comedy instead of actual people who were supposed to love each other. The cake was drying on both of us, and I could smell the sugar mixed with my makeup and his cologne. Everything felt broken and wrong, and I didn't know if we could fix it. A knock came at the door, and I heard our wedding coordinator's voice asking if we were ready to return to the reception. Jason and I looked at each other across the bridal suite and both said no at the exact same time. It was the first thing we'd agreed on all day. I wiped my eyes and Jason did the same, and we both looked like disasters between the crying and the cake and our ridiculous appearances. The coordinator opened the door a crack and peeked in, probably expecting to find us making up or at least looking ready to face our guests. Instead, she found us sitting far apart, covered in frosting with tear tracks down our faces. She asked if everything was okay, and I almost laughed because nothing was okay, and hadn't been okay since Jason came home bald 5 days ago. Jason told her we weren't feeling well and needed to cut the reception short. The coordinator's face showed relief for just a second before she caught herself and put on a professional expression. She said she'd make an announcement and help guests collect their things. I knew she was relieved because our disaster wedding was probably the worst thing that had ever happened to her portfolio. She'd probably have to explain to future clients why there were photos of a bald groom and goth bride in a pastel garden floating around online. The coordinator made some excuse about us both coming down with food poisoning and needing to rest. Guests started filing out of the reception area, and many of them stopped by the bridal suite to say goodbye. My mom came in crying and hugged me tight without saying anything about my black hair or pale makeup. She just held me and whispered that I should call her tomorrow when I was ready to talk. Jason's dad pulled him into the hallway, and I could see them through the doorway, having what looked like a serious conversation. Jason's dad had his hand on Jason's shoulder and was talking in a low voice while Jason just nodded and stared at the floor. My bridesmaids came by looking worried and asked if there was anything they could do. I told them I'd call them later, and they each hugged me before leaving. Jason's groomsmen clapped him on the back awkwardly on their way out, clearly not knowing what to say about the mess we'd made. Jason's grandmother stopped to look at both of us and shook her head before walking away without a word. My aunt gave me a look that was equal parts concern and judgment. Guest after guest filed past with expressions that showed they knew something was seriously wrong beyond just our hair situations. They could tell we'd hurt each other on purpose and turned what should have been a happy day into a battlefield. The reception hall emptied out, and Jason and I sat on opposite ends of the couch in the bridal suite. We were still in our wedding clothes, but they felt like costumes now instead of something special. The silence between us was different from before. It wasn't angry or hostile anymore, just tired. We'd both run out of ammunition and energy for fighting. I looked at Jason's bald head and my reflection in the mirror with my severe black bob and goth makeup. We looked like strangers who had accidentally ended up at the same wedding. The cake was still drying on both of us, and I could feel it getting sticky and uncomfortable. Jason shifted on the couch, and his dress shoes squeaked against the floor. Neither of us seemed to know what to say now that we were alone without an audience. The wedding coordinator knocked quietly and said she was locking up and we should take our time leaving. Her footsteps faded down the hallway, and then we were truly alone with what we'd done. Jason broke the silence by asking if I actually liked how I looked, or if I'd just done it to hurt him. His voice was quiet and tired instead of angry. I admitted it was purely revenge, and I hated everything about it. The black hair made my skin look washed out even under all the pale foundation. The purple lipstick tasted chemical and wrong. The whole look felt like I was wearing someone else's face. Jason nodded slowly and said he actually missed his hair, and only kept defending the decision because he was too proud to back down. He ran his hand over his bald head and said it felt weird and cold, and he regretted doing it the second the razor touched his scalp. But his friends were watching and cheering, and he couldn't admit he'd made a mistake, so he just kept going. Then when I got upset, he doubled down instead of apologizing, because that felt like admitting I was right to try to control him. We both sat with that for a minute before I said we'd turned our wedding into a battlefield. Jason agreed and added that we'd hurt each other in front of everyone we love. Our families and friends had watched us sabotage what was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. They'd seen us use our wedding as a weapon against each other, instead of as a celebration of our relationship. Jason said his head would grow back in a few months and my hair would eventually return to normal, but he wasn't sure how we fixed the actual damage we'd done to our relationship. The hair was just hair like he'd originally said, but what we'd done to each other went way deeper than appearances. We'd shown each other and everyone else that we were willing to destroy something important just to prove a point. I suggested we skip the honeymoon to the Maldives that we'd planned. We could use that time to figure out if we even wanted to stay married instead of spending a week pretending everything was fine on a beach. Jason's face showed fear for the first time all day. He looked scared in a way he hadn't when I'd walked up in my goth makeup or when we'd smashed cake in each other's faces. But he agreed and said he'd rather face our problems now than run away from them. He said a week in paradise wouldn't fix what was broken between us and might just delay the real conversation we needed to have. I felt relieved that he was finally being honest instead of defensive. We were both scared of what might happen if we really looked at our relationship, but we were more scared of continuing to hurt each other like this. We spent our wedding night in the hotel room that was supposed to be romantic. Instead, we moved around each other in silence, both processing what had happened. I went into the bathroom and started washing off the goth makeup. The purple lipstick came off in streaks and the black eyeliner left dark smudges under my eyes. I scrubbed at the pale foundation until my real skin showed through pink and raw. When I was done, I stared at my reflection with the severe black bob that I'd have to look at for months. I didn't recognize myself. The person staring back looked angry and petty and mean. I wondered how I'd become someone who would sabotage her own wedding out of spite. How had I gone from excited bride to this person who would rather ruin everything than let Jason win an argument? I heard Jason moving around in the bedroom, and knew he was probably thinking similar things about himself. The next morning, I woke up early and found Jason already awake sitting on the edge of the bed. The hotel room looked too cheerful with its romantic decorations that someone had set up for us. Rose petals on the bed and champagne in an ice bucket that had gone warm overnight. Jason turned to look at me and suggested we see a couples counselor before we made any major decisions about the marriage. I was surprised he was the one bringing up therapy since he usually avoided anything that felt too serious or emotional. But I agreed immediately because we clearly couldn't fix this on our own. We'd proven yesterday that left to our own devices, we just hurt each other worse and worse. We needed someone to help us figure out if this marriage was worth saving or if we'd already broken it beyond repair. We started calling therapists right away because neither of us wanted to sit with the silence anymore. Most of them couldn't see us for weeks, but we kept trying. Finally, we found one who specialized in premarital counseling and could see us that week. The receptionist asked if we were getting married soon, and there was an awkward pause where Jason and I looked at each other. He finally said we just got married yesterday. The receptionist went quiet for a second before saying she'd put us down for the first available appointment. I could hear the surprise in her voice and knew she was wondering what kind of couple needed emergency therapy the day after their wedding. 3 days later, I sat in the waiting room of a small office building downtown with Jason next to me on a gray couch that had definitely seen better days. The receptionist had given us forms to fill out, and I kept staring at the boxes asking about our relationship status. Married felt weird to check when we'd been married for less than a week and already needed emergency help. Jason filled out his form quickly and handed it back while I was still stuck on the first page, trying to decide how to explain our situation in the tiny comment box at the bottom. A door opened and a woman in her 30s with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail walked out holding a clipboard. She looked at us and her eyes went wide for just a second before she caught herself and smiled. I knew exactly what she was seeing because I'd gotten used to the stares over the past few days. My severe black bob that looked like I'd cut it myself in a fit of rage, and Jason's completely bald head that still had a slight shine to it under the office lights. She introduced herself and told us to follow her back to her office. The room was small with 2 chairs facing a desk and some plants on the windowsill that looked like they needed water. She sat down and asked us to tell her what brought us in. Jason and I looked at each other, and I could see he was waiting for me to start, so I took a breath and began explaining about the wedding planning and his hair and my retaliation. Saying it all out loud to a complete stranger made it sound even more insane than it had felt living through it. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I got to the part about walking up behind Jason in my goth makeup, her pen stopped moving and she just stared at me for a second. Jason jumped in and added details about the reception and the cake smashing and how our guests thought we'd lost our minds. By the time we finished explaining the whole disaster, we'd both gone quiet. The office felt too small and too warm, and I realized how ridiculous and sad the whole thing was when I heard it coming out of my mouth as a story instead of just living through it moment by moment. She put down her pen and leaned back in her chair. She asked Jason what he was feeling in the weeks before the wedding, and he shifted in his seat like the question made him uncomfortable. He talked about feeling like a prop in my production, and how every time he tried to give input, I'd already decided everything. His voice got tighter as he spoke, and I felt my face getting hot because some of what he was saying was true, even though I didn't want to admit it. She turned to me and asked the same question. I told her about feeling like Jason didn't care about something that was really important to me, and how his head shaving felt like he was saying the whole wedding was a joke. My voice cracked when I talked about seeing him bald that morning and realizing he'd done it without even thinking about how it would affect me. She nodded and wrote something down, then looked at both of us with an expression that was kind, but also serious. She said it sounded like we both felt unheard, and instead of talking about it, we'd responded by trying to hurt each other. The words hit me hard because that was exactly what I'd done. I hadn't cut and dyed my hair because I actually wanted to look like that. I'd done it specifically to hurt Jason the way he'd hurt me. She kept talking and said the hair situation was just a symptom of way deeper problems with how we talked to each other and showed respect. She said these issues existed long before the wedding, and we'd just acted them out in a really visible, dramatic way that everyone got to witness. Over the next few weeks, we came back to her office twice a week. Each session felt like peeling back another layer of something I didn't really want to look at. She started asking us questions about how we handled conflict in general, and what our families were like growing up. I talked about how my mom was always anxious about things going wrong and how I'd learned to control situations to keep everyone calm. Jason talked about how his dad was really strict, and he'd spent his whole teenage years rebelling against rules. She pointed out patterns we couldn't see ourselves. She showed me how I used control to manage my anxiety instead of just saying I was scared or worried. She showed Jason how he used rebellion to prove he was independent instead of just asking for what he needed. Every session felt like homework I hadn't studied for, because she kept pointing out things I did without realizing I was doing them. I'd interrupt Jason when he was talking, and she'd stop me and ask why I felt like I needed to correct him right then. Jason would shut down when we talked about difficult topics, and she'd point out how his face changed and his answers got shorter. We were learning to see ourselves in ways that made me really uncomfortable. During one session about a month in, she asked Jason about his friends and what they'd said at his bachelor party. He got quiet for a minute, then admitted his friends had been making jokes about losing his freedom and how marriage was a trap. He said when they dared him to shave his head, it felt like a way to prove he was still his own person, and not just someone who followed orders. Hearing him say it out loud made me realize the dare wasn't really about the dare at all. It was about him being scared of being trapped and using the head shaving as proof he could still make his own choices. She asked me about the wedding planning and why it was so important that everything be perfect. I started crying before I even knew why, and then it all came tumbling out about how I was terrified something would go wrong, and everyone would think I couldn't handle adult responsibilities. I'd planned every single detail because I thought if I controlled everything, then nothing bad could happen. But instead, I'd created exactly the disaster I was trying to prevent by pushing Jason so hard he felt like he had to rebel. We both sat there in her office realizing we'd destroyed our own wedding because we were too scared to just talk about what we were actually afraid of. She gave us homework that felt impossible at first. We had to practice telling each other what we needed without attacking or trying to control the outcome. She said we each had to share one thing we needed from the relationship, and the other person had to just listen without getting defensive or explaining why we were wrong. The first time we tried it at home, we both failed immediately. Jason told me he needed to feel like an equal partner, and I jumped in to explain all the times I had asked his opinion. She'd warned us we'd do exactly that. The next time we tried, I forced myself to just sit there and listen while Jason talked. It was physically hard to not interrupt or defend myself. My whole body wanted to jump in and correct him, but I made myself stay quiet. When it was my turn, I told Jason I needed to feel like the things that mattered to me actually mattered to him, even when he didn't fully understand why they were important. He started to say something, then stopped himself and just nodded. It wasn't much, but it felt like a tiny step toward actually hearing each other instead of just waiting for our turn to talk. 2 weeks after the wedding, we had a session where she asked us each to say one specific thing we needed going forward. Jason looked at me and said he needed to feel like an equal partner in decisions instead of someone who just got told what the plan was. His voice was steady and he didn't sound angry, just honest. I felt defensive immediately, but I remembered the homework and made myself really listen to what he was saying. When it was my turn, I told him I needed to feel like he valued the things that mattered to me, even if he thought they were silly or didn't get why I cared so much. I said when he shaved his head, it felt like he was saying my feelings about the wedding photos didn't matter at all. Jason's face changed, and he looked like he was actually understanding what I meant for the first time. She asked us both how it felt to say those things and hear them, and we both admitted it was scary, but also kind of relieving to just be honest instead of playing games. We started having different kinds of conversations at home after that. One night we were eating dinner and Jason brought up how he tends to avoid talking about problems until they get so big he explodes. He said he'd been doing that our whole relationship, and he could see now how it made me feel like I had to control everything, because I never knew what he was actually thinking. I told him I could see how I tried to manage situations when I got anxious instead of just saying I was worried or scared. I admitted that planning the wedding had been my way of feeling in control, when really I was just terrified of messing up something important. We weren't fixing everything with these talks, but we were starting to actually see each other instead of just seeing our own versions of what we thought the other person was doing. It felt fragile, like we were learning a new language and kept messing up the words, but at least we were trying. 1 month after the wedding, I woke up and caught myself watching Jason to see if he was going to do something impulsive again. He was just making coffee, but I realized I was analyzing his every move, looking for signs that he was about to make another big decision without telling me. Later that day, he told me he felt like he was walking on eggshells around me and couldn't relax because he knew I was waiting for him to mess up again. We were both stuck in this place where we'd hurt each other so badly that now we couldn't trust each other to not do it again. Every little thing felt loaded with meaning. If Jason wanted to go out with friends, I immediately worried he was going to come home with another shaved head or a tattoo or something worse. If I suggested we make plans for the weekend, Jason tensed up like I was trying to control his schedule. We were making progress in therapy, but at home we were still treating each other like enemies who'd signed a temporary truce. In our next session, she said we needed to focus on rebuilding trust through small, consistent actions instead of waiting for some big moment that would fix everything. She explained that trust wasn't something we could force or rush. It had to be built slowly through showing up for each other in little ways every single day. She gave us a new assignment to do daily check-ins where we each shared one thing we appreciated about the other person that day. It had to be specific, not just generic compliments. Jason looked skeptical, and I felt skeptical too because it sounded like the kind of thing that would feel fake and forced. But she said to try it anyway for 2 weeks and see what happened. That night we sat on our couch and Jason went first. He said he appreciated that I'd asked him what he wanted for dinner instead of just deciding. It was such a small thing, but hearing him say it made me realize how many tiny choices I made without including him. When it was my turn, I told him I appreciated that he'd texted me during the day to check in instead of just disappearing into his own world. We both felt awkward saying these things out loud, but we agreed to keep trying. The homework felt silly, but also like maybe it was the kind of silly we needed to start actually seeing each other as real people again, instead of just as the person who'd ruined our wedding. The first week of daily check-ins felt forced and awkward. I sat next to Jason on the couch each evening and tried to find something specific to appreciate about him that day. Some nights I struggled to think of anything because I was still angry about the wedding and everything that led up to it. But I kept trying because Summer had said consistency mattered more than perfection. Jason seemed to have the same problem at first. He'd pause for a long time before coming up with something generic that didn't really mean anything. But after about 10 days, something started to shift. I noticed him paying more attention during the day to things I did or said. He'd mentioned that he appreciated when I asked him what movie he wanted to watch instead of just picking one, or that he noticed I didn't rearrange his stuff on the counter when he left it out. Small things that I wouldn't have thought twice about before, but hearing him point them out made me realize how many tiny controlling habits I'd developed without even knowing it. I started noticing things about him too, like how he texted me during his lunch break just to check in, not because I'd asked him to, but because he wanted to. Or how he asked if I needed anything from the store before coming home instead of just showing up. These weren't big romantic gestures, but they felt more real than anything we'd done during our 18 months of wedding planning. We were actually seeing each other as people instead of as problems to solve or battles to win. One morning, about 6 weeks after the wedding, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and realized my hair was growing out. The severe black bob had softened a bit, and I could see blonde roots coming in at the top. I'd been so focused on therapy and trying to fix things with Jason that I hadn't really thought about my hair since the wedding day. Jason walked in while I was staring at myself and made a joke about how we were both growing back from our wedding day insanity. His head had stubble now instead of being completely smooth, and you could see the brown hair starting to come back. He ran his hand over his head and laughed, saying we should take a photo to document our recovery process. It was the first time either of us had joked about what happened without it turning into a fight. I actually smiled and took a selfie of both of us in the bathroom mirror with our partially grown-out hair. We looked ridiculous, but also kind of hopeful, like we were both working our way back to something better. 2 months after the wedding, a package arrived at our apartment. I recognized the return address as the photographer's studio, and my stomach dropped. Jason was at work, so I sat alone on the couch staring at the box for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to open it. The wedding photos were inside on a USB drive along with a few printed samples. I pulled out the prints, and there we were in all our bizarre glory. A completely bald groom in a nice suit standing next to a goth bride in a white dress surrounded by pastel garden flowers. It looked like a comedy sketch or some kind of weird art project, not a real wedding. I started laughing because it was just so absurd. How had we let things get this bad? How had we both been so petty and angry that we'd turned our wedding into this nightmare? I was still laughing when Jason came home and found me sitting on the couch with the photos spread out around me. He looked nervous at first, probably expecting me to be crying or angry. But when he saw I was laughing, he picked up one of the photos and started laughing too. We spent the next hour going through all the images on the laptop, pointing out how ridiculous we both looked and how confused our guests appeared in the background. The photographer had actually done an amazing job making the best of an impossible situation, but that somehow made it even funnier. These were supposed to be romantic memories we'd treasure forever, and instead they looked like Halloween photos taken at the wrong event. That night, after we'd finished looking through all the photos, Jason got quiet. I could tell he was thinking about something serious because he kept picking at the label on his beer bottle. Finally, he said that if we made it through this and actually fixed things, he wanted to do a small vow renewal ceremony in a year. Nothing fancy or expensive, just something simple where we both actually wanted to be there and meant what we were saying. He said we could take normal photos where we both looked like ourselves and actually remembered the day without cringing. I felt something shift in my chest when he said that. He wasn't just thinking about surviving the next few months or getting through therapy. He was thinking about our actual future together as a couple who might make it. I told him I'd like that too, and I meant it. For the first time since the wedding disaster, I felt like maybe we could actually build something real instead of just trying to repair what we'd broken. We started telling people about the therapy after that conversation. Not everyone, just close friends and family who'd been worried about us since the wedding. Most people were supportive and relieved that we were working on things instead of just pretending everything was fine. My best friend admitted she'd been scared we were going to announce a separation any day. Jason's best man said he felt guilty about the bachelor party and the dare, and Jason told him it wasn't his fault that we'd both made terrible choices. But some people were more skeptical. A few friends seemed to think we were wasting our time trying to save something that was clearly broken from the start. One of Jason's buddies told him he should cut his losses and get an annulment while it was still easy. That comment bothered Jason more than he wanted to admit. He came home that night looking defeated and said maybe his friend was right. Maybe we were just delaying the inevitable. Jason's mother called a few days later and invited us over for dinner. She said she had something she wanted to talk to us about. I was nervous during the drive over because I thought maybe she was going to tell us we should split up. She'd been supportive, but I knew she was worried about her son being in a marriage that started so badly. But when we sat down at her dining room table, she surprised me. She told us she was proud that we were doing the work to fix things instead of just giving up when it got hard. Then she shared something I'd never heard before. She and Jason's dad had gone through a really rough patch early in their marriage and almost didn't make it. She said they'd fought constantly for the first 2 years and came very close to divorce. But they'd gone to counseling and learned how to actually communicate instead of just hurting each other. Looking at them now, you'd never know they'd struggled because they seemed so stable and happy together. She told us that marriage was hard work, and the wedding was just one day. But the actual relationship was what mattered. She said if we were both willing to put in the effort, we had a real chance at making it work. Jason teared up when his mom was talking, and I realized how much he'd needed to hear that from her. My parents had a different reaction when I told them about therapy. They came over for lunch the following weekend, and I explained that Jason and I were working with a counselor to fix our communication problems. My mom looked worried and my dad looked skeptical. They asked if we were sure we were compatible, or if the wedding incident had revealed something deeper about our relationship that couldn't be fixed. My dad said he didn't want to see me waste years trying to save something that was broken from the beginning. I understood their concern because they'd witnessed the whole disaster and seen how hurt I'd been. I explained that we were learning to communicate better and actually addressing the problems instead of ignoring them. But I could tell they weren't convinced. My mom hugged me before they left and told me she just wanted me to be happy, and if that meant ending things with Jason, then that was okay too. The conversation left me feeling shaken because part of me wondered if they were right. Were we just prolonging something that was always going to fail? 3 months after the wedding, Summer asked us a direct question during our session. She wanted to know what we'd each learned about ourselves and each other through this process. Jason went first. He said he'd learned that I wasn't trying to control him out of meanness, or because I didn't trust him. He'd realized that my need to plan and manage everything came from anxiety and fear, not from wanting to dominate him. He said understanding that changed how he felt about my behavior. Instead of seeing it as an attack on his freedom, he could see it as me trying to feel safe. He said that made him want to help me feel secure instead of fighting against me all the time. Summer nodded and asked me the same question. I told her I'd learned that Jason's need for independence didn't mean he didn't love me or care about our relationship. I'd been taking his desire for autonomy as a personal rejection, like he was trying to get away from me. But I was starting to understand that he needed to feel like his own person, and that was okay. I said I was learning to express what mattered to me without demanding that he feel exactly the same way about it. I could tell him that the wedding photos were important to me without expecting him to care about them as much as I did. I was learning that we could have different priorities and still be partners. Summer listened to both of us and then asked a harder question. She wanted to know if we were staying together because we genuinely wanted to build a life together, or because we were afraid of admitting the marriage was a mistake. She said we'd both grown a lot in 3 months, but that growth didn't necessarily mean we belonged together. It was a question that hit me right in the stomach because I hadn't let myself think about it that directly. Were we working this hard because we loved each other, or because we were too proud or scared to admit we'd made a huge mistake by getting married? I looked at Jason across the therapy room and said we needed time away from everything. He nodded and suggested we find a cabin somewhere quiet where we could just talk. No therapist, no family calling to check on us, no daily routines reminding us of all our problems. Summer thought it was a good idea and said sometimes couples needed space to process what they'd learned without the structure of weekly sessions. We found a small cabin 2 hours north that was available the following weekend. The place had no TV and spotty cell service, which felt both scary and necessary. We packed light and drove up on Friday afternoon without much conversation. The silence between us felt different from before, less hostile and more uncertain, like we were both afraid of what this weekend might reveal. The cabin sat at the edge of a lake surrounded by pine trees. Inside was basic, just a bedroom, small kitchen, and living room with a fireplace. We unpacked our bags and stood awkwardly in the main room, suddenly aware that we had 3 whole days with nothing to do but face each other. Jason made coffee while I started a fire, and we sat on the worn couch watching the flames. He broke the silence first, saying he wasn't sure we could fix everything, but he wanted to try. I admitted I felt the same way. That part of me was still angry about the wedding and scared we'd just hurt each other again. We talked late into the night about things we'd never said out loud. Jason told me his friends had been in his ear for months before the wedding, telling him marriage would change him, and I'd try to control every part of his life. He said he'd started to believe them, and the bachelor party dare felt like his last chance to prove he was still his own person. I told him I'd been so focused on creating the perfect wedding that I'd stopped seeing him as a partner and started treating him like another detail to manage. We both cried. Not the angry tears from before, but the exhausted kind that comes from finally being honest. The next morning we woke up and made breakfast together, moving around the small kitchen without our usual tension. Jason suggested we try something Summer had mentioned in one of our early sessions, writing down what we actually needed from each other instead of just listing complaints. We sat at the wooden table with paper and pens, and I stared at the blank page for a long time. Writing it down felt more real than just saying it in therapy, like we were making actual promises we'd have to keep. I wrote that I needed him to tell me when something bothered him instead of letting it build until he exploded. I needed to feel like we were making decisions together instead of me planning everything, and him going along until he rebelled. I needed him to understand that my need to organize things came from anxiety, not from wanting to control him. Jason wrote his list across from me, his pen moving slowly like he was choosing each word carefully. When we traded papers, I read that he needed me to trust him to make his own choices even if they were different from what I would pick. He needed to feel like an equal partner instead of someone who just followed my plans. He needed me to ask for his input instead of assuming he didn't care about things just because he showed it differently than I did. We talked about what we'd written for hours, sitting at that table while the morning turned to afternoon. Jason said he'd promised to speak up when something bothered him instead of shutting down or doing something extreme to get my attention. I promised to include him in decisions and actually listen to his ideas instead of just managing everything myself. It felt like we were writing new vows, the ones we should have said at our actual wedding instead of the generic promises we'd barely thought about. By Sunday afternoon, we both felt different, not fixed, but more honest about what we were trying to build together. Jason suggested we renew our vows privately when we were ready, just the two of us without the pressure of guests or photographers or perfect aesthetics. I liked the idea of starting over in a way that felt real instead of performed. We drove home that evening feeling closer than we had in months, maybe closer than we'd been before the wedding disaster. Summer smiled when we told her about the cabin weekend in our next session. She said it sounded like we'd made real progress, but reminded us that growth wasn't a straight line. We'd have setbacks and hard days, and we'd need to keep practicing these new communication skills, even when it felt easier to fall back into old patterns. She was right, because over the next few weeks we caught ourselves slipping sometimes. I'd start planning Jason's schedule without asking him, and he'd shut down instead of telling me something bothered him. But we were quicker to notice and correct it now, calling each other out gently instead of letting resentment build. 4 months after the disaster wedding, we decided it was time for that private vow renewal Jason had suggested. We went back to the garden venue on a random Tuesday afternoon when no one else had it booked. The staff looked confused when we showed up in jeans and casual shirts, asking if we wanted to walk around the grounds. I explained we'd gotten married there a few months ago and just wanted to see it again. Jason's hair had grown back into a short brown cut that looked good on him, and my hair was shoulder length and mostly blonde again with just some dark ends I was growing out. We walked through the garden holding hands, and it looked completely different in the afternoon light. The flowers were still pretty but less perfect than they'd been for our sunset wedding, some petals dropping and leaves a bit brown at the edges. We found a quiet spot under a tree away from the main paths. Jason pulled out the papers we'd written at the cabin, now folded and worn from being carried in his wallet. I had mine in my purse, the edges soft from being read and reread. We stood facing each other like we had 4 months ago, but this time there was no officiant, no photographer, no guests watching and whispering. Jason went first, his voice shaking a little as he promised to tell me when something bothered him, instead of letting it explode into something bigger. He promised to remember that my need to plan came from fear, and to help me feel secure instead of fighting against it. He promised to see me as a partner, not as someone trying to control him. Tears ran down his face as he spoke, and I reached up to wipe them away. My turn came, and I promised to trust him to make his own choices, even when they were different from what I would pick. I promised to include him as an equal partner in decisions instead of managing everything myself. I promised to remember that his need for independence wasn't about rejecting me, but about being his own person. I was crying too by the end, and we both stood there in our jeans under that tree, crying and holding each other. Jason pulled out his phone and we took a selfie together, both of us with red eyes and messy hair and real smiles. The photo was slightly blurry and totally unposed, and it felt more genuine than any of the professional shots from our actual wedding. We sat on the grass and talked about how strange it felt to be back here, in this place where everything had gone so wrong. But somehow being here now, choosing each other again without all the pressure and performance, made it feel like we were actually starting our marriage on honest terms. We weren't pretending the wedding disaster hadn't happened, or that we'd magically fixed everything. We were just choosing to keep trying together. Summer told us in our next session that she was impressed with how far we'd come, but reminded us again that growth wasn't linear. She said we'd have setbacks, days when old patterns would resurface, and we'd need to be patient with ourselves and each other. She was preparing us for the reality that marriage was ongoing work, not a problem you solved once and moved on from. 5 months after the wedding, we were in a better place but still working through issues. I caught myself trying to plan Jason's schedule sometimes, old habits surfacing when I felt anxious about something. He caught himself shutting down instead of speaking up, especially when he felt criticized. But we were both quicker to recognize these patterns now and call them out before they became bigger problems. We'd stop mid-argument sometimes and actually laugh at ourselves for falling into the same old traps. One evening, Jason suggested we plan a trip together, something small where we both had equal say in what we did. It sounded simple, but turned out to be harder than either of us expected. I wanted to research everything and create a detailed plan with backup options, and Jason wanted to just show up and be spontaneous. We sat at our kitchen table with a laptop between us, trying to figure out how to blend our completely different approaches. I'd start looking up hotels, and Jason would say we should just drive and find something when we got there. He'd suggest we wing it for meals, and I'd worry about ending up hungry in an area with no restaurants. We spent 3 hours on that trip planning and almost gave up twice. But finally, we figured out a compromise, a loose structure with room for flexibility. We'd book a hotel for the first night so we knew we had a place to sleep, but leave the other nights open. We'd research a few restaurants and activities but not schedule them, just have options if we wanted them. It wasn't perfect for either of us, but it felt like actual teamwork instead of one person winning and the other giving in. We left on a Wednesday morning and drove 3 hours to a small beach town neither of us had visited before. Jason wanted to skip breakfast and just grab something on the road, but I'd packed granola bars and fruit just in case, and he rolled his eyes but ate them anyway. We found our hotel easily because I'd saved the address but didn't make a big deal about pulling it up on my phone. The room was basic but clean with a view of the water, and Jason immediately wanted to go explore while I wanted to unpack and settle in first. We compromised by taking 10 minutes to drop our bags and change into walking clothes, then headed out. The town had a main street with little shops and restaurants, and we wandered without any real plan. Jason pointed out a seafood place that looked good, and I agreed even though I hadn't researched it, fighting my instinct to check reviews first. We ate lunch there and the food was actually great, and Jason grinned at me like he'd won something, but in a way that felt playful instead of mean. After lunch, I suggested we walk on the beach, and he wanted to rent bikes instead. So we did both by biking along the boardwalk first, and then leaving the bikes to walk in the sand. I kept catching myself trying to plan what we'd do next, or worrying about dinner reservations. But I'd take a breath and just focus on being there with him. Jason noticed me doing it once and squeezed my hand, not saying anything but acknowledging the effort. We stayed 3 days and fell into an easy rhythm where we'd each suggest things and figure out together what sounded good. Some moments were still tense, like when I got anxious about not having a backup plan for a restaurant that turned out to be closed, or when Jason got annoyed that I'd brought an umbrella he thought we didn't need. But we talked through it instead of letting it explode into a fight, and by the last day we were both surprised at how much we'd enjoyed ourselves. Back home a month later, we were sorting through some boxes in our closet when Jason pulled out the envelope from our wedding photographer. We'd avoided looking at most of the photos since that first awful viewing, but something made us sit down and go through them again. There was one shot in particular that captured the full absurdity of that day. Jason's bald head gleaming in the garden sunlight, my severe black bob and goth makeup against the pastel flowers, both of us standing stiffly with forced smiles that didn't reach our eyes. Jason started laughing first, that genuine laugh that I loved, and then I was laughing too at how ridiculous we looked. We decided right then to frame it, not to forget what happened, but to remember what we'd learned. I found a simple black frame and we hung it in our living room where we'd see it every day. Friends who visited would ask about it with confused expressions, and we'd tell them the story, no longer embarrassed but treating it as a lesson we'd both needed to learn. The photo became a touchstone for us, something we'd glance at during arguments as a reminder not to let things spiral like they had before. Now, almost 7 months after the wedding, we were in a completely different place but still working on ourselves. Jason's hair had grown back to about 2 inches, still shorter than before but starting to look like him again. Mine was fully blonde now after months of growing out the black dye and cutting off the damaged parts. But the real changes weren't about our hair. We still had hard days where old patterns tried to resurface. Last week, I caught myself making a detailed plan for Jason's birthday, without asking what he wanted, and he had to gently remind me that he'd like some input. 2 days ago, Jason agreed to plans with his friends without checking if we had something scheduled first, and I had to fight the urge to lecture him about consideration. We weren't perfect and probably never would be, but we were building something honest instead of performing some fantasy version of a relationship. We'd learned that loving each other meant accepting different approaches and finding ways to meet in the middle, even when it was uncomfortable. The bizarre wedding photo hanging on our wall reminded us every day that we'd almost destroyed everything by fighting for control instead of fighting for each other.